Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, my dear students. Our current session is about standard languages. I hope and expect by the end of this session you would be able to understand the term and how does it operate. Well, in order to understand what do we mean by standard languages and how do they operate, we need to think about a few things. A, what are standard languages? B, what are non-standard languages? And how is the distinction drawn? How standard languages are differentiated from the non-standard languages. I hope through the session you would be able to find answers to these questions. Well, standard language is probably fair to say about it that the only kind of variety which would count as a proper language is called a standard language. Standard languages are interesting in a way as in terms of the special relationship that it have with the society. Now, this relationship that I'm going to talk about in detail is very special in the sense and very abnormal in the sense as well, because when we think of it during the times where languages have been used by human beings in the history, their context of being, standardized, I would say, is very different. Standard languages actually are the result of direct and deliberate intervention of the society. When we talk of languages, otherwise, we would say in order to interact, in order to have conversations, people would use linguistic codes, and as the communities or groups, they would use it, or different societies would use it, different languages or varieties of languages or dialects would emerge. However, the case of standard languages is different. There is a deliberate, there is a conscious effort, there is a direct intervention by the society to create them. What is this intervention? The process of standardizing a particular variety as a standard language. Of course, before that, it would either be a non-standard language or a dialect. So the notion standard language is somewhat imprecise, but a typical standard language will have passed through different processes to gain the status or the position of a standard language. It would go through the process of selection. Any society, remember I have already said that a society would have a direct, role, a conscious role played in the making or standardizing of a language. So, the first step that a society would take is of a selection. Once a language is selected by a society as a standard language, then it would be codified. So, the second step is codification. The third step is elaboration of its functions. The society, the concerned users, or the authorities amongst them, they would decide, they would elaborate upon the functions for which this particular standard language would be used. Now we can talk about each of these processes in detail. Coming towards the first step, that is selection. Somehow or the other, a particular variety must be selected as to be developed as a standard language. So, if there are certain non-standard languages or there are certain dialects, one has to be picked, it has to be chosen to be established as a standard language. Now, this particular choice or selection that is made, it can be of a language that is one of the existing varieties, such as, it is used in a political context or in any commercial center, etc. But there is also a possibility that, it is not a language that is being used currently. It can be an amalgamation of more than one varieties that can be, selected and then established as a standard language. And how this selection is made? This is a highly, I would say, political and socially significant, process where, many political and social factors would play their role in the choice. The chosen variety necessarily gains prestige, and of course now, when being a standard language, or selected as a standard language, it gets prestige. People would be attracted, of course, towards that. However, in some cases, the chosen variety may not be a native speaker's language. For example, if we think of the classical Hebrew in case of, Israel, you would find that it is not a variety that is used in everyday language. Also, the two standard modern varieties of Norwegian can be example. This leads us to the understanding of the second step of the process of standardization, which is called codification. What do we mean by codification? Well, there has to be some agency, there has to be some academy, or there has to be some institution which would codify it, which means which would write dictionaries, which would write books, which would write rules of how to use it, which would fix this variety, the problems within the variety, which would lay the rules, establish the rules, and which would, declare what is right and what is wrong. And whatsoever this academy or institution or organization would do, this would be what everybody would accept or agree upon as the correct version. Once this process of codification has taken place, it becomes necessary for all the ambitious citizens of that, society, or all the members of that community to learn how to correctly use its forms and how to write this and how to differentiate it from the incorrect forms that may exist at that time. The third step is a natural result of that is the elaboration of the function. It must be possible to use the selected variety in all the functions associated with central government or with writing. So mainly this language, for example, would be used for parliament, for laws, for education, for bureaucracy, for scientific documentations, and of course in various forms of literature as well. This may require extra linguistic items now, because now it is selected as a standard language. It needs to expand. It needs to provide the lexical items to fulfill all these functions that I have talked about. So, and especially, the technical vocabulary. So, the language would provide that. Now, it is also necessary to develop new conventions for using existing forms. For example, how a question paper would be developed, how in academia, for example, and how a letter would be written, for example, a formal letter in business, correspondence. So, all these standards of using it and its different forms would also be set. The next step is acceptance. Once all these processes are done, the variety has to be accepted by the relevant population as a variety of the community, and generally, it is taken as a national language of that community. Once this has happened, the standard language serves certain purposes. It serves as a strong unifying force for that community or for that state. It becomes a symbol of independence. It also, becomes a marker of differentiating that community or state or nation from other communities and from other states.